Happy Thursday, everybody. I hope you're ready for a great weekend. Learning how to read the Bible is really about learning how to ask the right questions and even knowing what are the right questions to ask. Often we as modern readers begin reading the Bible with what does it mean for me? What is the impact of this story or this psalm or this passage upon my life? That actually is not a wrong question, but it should never be the first question. In fact, putting ourselves in the middle of the story actually impedes our ability to accurately read the Bible. We come to that one at the end. We should first start out by carefully reading the text. What was said? Too often, we bring our assumptions to our reading and we don't read the text carefully. So start with what was said. The second question you need to ask is what was meant by what was said. Notice that both of these questions are focusing on the Bible and its world before I bring it into mine. This is very important because now we are in a place to discover how the spatial, historical, cultural, and spiritual context of the Bible bleed through every page, every passage of the Bible. The narratives, the Psalms, the prophecies, the parables, the letters, and even the apocalypses. We need to also understand that the biblical writers assume the knowledge of their readers about the contextual world of the Bible. They assume the spatial knowledge. They assume the historical and cultural and spiritual knowledge that often we lack. Now, you may say, well, that seems like a pretty daunting task. Well, it's worth it, number one, but number two, it's not as hard as you think. Let me explain. Now, the importance of this can be illustrated by something that you find actually in Jerusalem when you visit it today. At the Israel Museum, there is a large-scale model of Jerusalem that was built back in the 1950s and early 60s, but it represents Jerusalem on the eve of its destructions by the Roman in the year AD 70, so at the end of the first century. This model was built by Professor Michael Aviona of the Hebrew University and his students before that area of Jerusalem was able to be excavated, which housed the actual remains of Jerusalem in the first century. So how were they able to build such an accurate model of Jerusalem? It's because we have a source, a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus from the first century. And Josephus was writing to people who did not know the land of Israel, did not know Israel's history, did not know the cultural or the spiritual context of the Jewish people, so he explained it to them. This is why Josephus is such an important source for we as modern readers of the New Testament. And what he does is in his description of Jerusalem, he takes his readers on a walk around of the city. Now notice if you open your Old Testament Hebrew Bible, you cannot build a similar model just off the literary information we have in the Hebrew Bible. Why? Because the writers of the Hebrew Bible assume that you and I know where these things are, and we don't. Now today we can start to build some of those models because of archaeology, but based on the literary sources alone, we cannot. So it's important that we begin to discover the ancient sources that introduce us into the spatial, historical, cultural, and spiritual worlds of the Bible. And I want to give you a couple of tips quickly here on how to do that with the historical context. Now, first of all, when we go to read the Bible, we can't read it all as one book. Between Abraham and David was 1,000 years. Between David and Jesus was 1,000 years. I'm not going to get to know any of you by going and studying somebody that lived 1,000 years ago. Right? Dylan has taught us the times they are a-changing, and we've got to pay attention to that as we read chronologically through the Bible. But notice when you open the Gospel of Luke to chapter 3, when Luke frames the beginning of the ministry of John the Baptist and Jesus, he does so by framing it geographically and politically. In the 15th year of the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, Pontius Pilate, governor of Judea, Antipas, the governor of Galilee, Philip, the governor of the Golan and Iturea, etc., etc., etc. Who are these people? Luke assumes you know. He assumes you know the background that brought Rome to be in control of the land of Israel. He also assumes that you know the geographic realities that he's describing there, because it's more than just geographic regions. These are geopolitical realities. So what do we have to do? First thing we need to do is we need to acquaint ourselves with these historical figures. Again, it's assumed that we know what this is, who these are, and what their impact was on the world of the New Testament. So we need to expose ourselves to that. We need to learn about it. How do we do that? Well, we can go and we can read books and we can read articles and we can find secondary sources online. But let me encourage you. The writings of Josephus have been translated into English. Now, I'm not saying start on page 1 and read all the way through. That's a little bit of a daunting task. Don't do that. But you do know that Josephus is going to speak about Tiberius. Josephus is going to speak about Antipas and about Philip and about Caiaphas and about Annas. So get in the habit. Take a special highlighter, special color that is going to be your historical context highlighter, and get in the habit of whenever you come across a historical person, a king, a governor, an empire, you highlight it. You pay attention to chronological details. And then you go and you find out about it. You can read Josephus, and I would encourage you to do so. Also, let me just point out, Matthew chapter 2, we find introduced one of the most fascinating characters that lived in the first century, Herod the Great, the father of Antipas and Philip. And guess what? Herod the Great, we find him playing a very pivotal role in Matthew chapter 2, but Matthew assumes that we know who he was, what his psychology was. Well, how do we get at that? We get at that by going and reading our greatest source on the life of Herod, which again is Josephus. So pay attention to these historical details. It's in that we answer that context that we begin to answer that second question, what did it mean? And finally, after we've answered what was said, we've read our text carefully. What was meant by what was said, we've entered the world of the Bible. Now we're in a position to say, what does it mean for me today? What's the impact that this has on my life and upon my community? That's how you go about reading the Bible, learning how to ask the right questions. Have a great weekend, everyone.